Welcome to this session in the Economy Strand. Is there a case for tariffs today? I'm Rob Lyons, and I'm convener of the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum. On the 2nd of April, to much fanfare, President Trump announced Liberation Day, imposing swingeing tariffs on imports to the United States, even on friendly countries with low or no trade surplus with the US. Using the tariffs, Trump has negotiated deals with a wide array of countries and groups, with many on significantly favourable terms with the US. However, it is far from clear that the policy has solved America's trade deficit and may indeed have made it worse, according to some commentators. Many worry that the result may be higher prices for Americans. Now, after decades when the mantra was free trade, protectionism is now advocated as a legitimate means to advance a nation's interests. So were the downsides of protectionism always overstated? Can tariffs help an advanced country reindustrialize and become self-sufficient? Doesn't the reawakening legitimacy of national interest justify protectionism as bettering the lives of a country's population? Big questions, great panel. And we'll start off on my immediate left with Catherine McBride, who's an economist and trade specialist. Catherine worked in financial services for 20 years, trading and advising clients on international equity and commodity markets. She campaigned for Brexit, ran the Brexit coalition in the run-up to the 2019 election, has worked in various think tanks, and is a fellow of the Centre for Brexit Policy. She was awarded the OBE in 2024. To Catherine's left is William C. Hicks. Bill Hicks is co-chair of Mintz's Life Sciences Practice Group and former co-chair of the firm's Securities and Capital Markets Practice. He's regularly asked to speak in the US, UK and Europe on matters specific to accessing US capital markets. And then, ironically, on my far right, William Clouston is party leader of the Social Democratic Party, a post he was elected to in 2018. He's written articles for The Spectator, Spiked and Unheard, and regularly makes media appearances on talk radio. Last but not least is Phil Mullan, who is a writer, lecturer and business manager, author of Beyond Confrontation, Globalists, Nationalists and Their Discontents, and Creative Destruction, How to Start an Economic Renaissance. I've introduced everything, so let's get cracking straight away with Catherine.
Hi, I'm going to sit down while I speak. Hopefully that works for everyone. Most people think of tariffs as being a way of protecting local industries, but the UK is not tariff-free. The UK has tariffs on almost everything. A lot of this started when we joined the EU, but I think we actually started tariffs in the 1700s when we had the calico taxes on imported cotton, which was an attempt to protect the British wool industry. And as most of you will probably know, you're probably all wearing cotton T-shirts and shirts around the room, that didn't work very well. The good news is that eventually we got rid of the calico tax and Manchester became the world's biggest producer of cotton because it had mechanized. And so it wasn't tariffs that caused that to happen. It was actually dropping the tariffs and using mechanization and coal to drive a new industry. And then the UK was producing cotton for everyone. Right now, we still have 12% tariffs on clothes, which most people are surprised by. And yet, this jacket was made in China. My top was made in Cambodia. The trousers were made in Italy, I think, and the boots come from Turkey. They've all got English labels on them, but none of them were made here because we've made it too expensive to actually make goods here. It's the wages, the benefits for employment, the cost of energy, the environmental regulations, which are very strict in terms of dyes and things like that. A lot of making of clothing is pretty polluting. There'll be places in India where they do a lot of the dyeing of jeans. It's not great for the water supply. And so the West was happy to export a lot of these industries to developing nations. And the developing nations did quite well out of it. They got, a lot of employed people who may not have been generally employed before that. But they also got a lot of problems with pollution and stuff like that. So it wasn't always our greatest thing, but we kept the tariffs on, which meant that the goods we're importing are more expensive for us. And we do not really have a UK clothing manufacturing business anymore unless you are talking about, say, Barbour and Macintosh. Some raincoats are still made in the UK. Savile Row suits are made in the UK, but the material is imported from Italy, and it uses spun merino wool, which was spun in China, and the Chinese got the wool from Australia. And so you might have made in Britain on the label, but all the other steps in that process were not in Britain. So tariffs as protection doesn't work. Maybe looking at our economic policies would work. But what has happened recently is President Trump has changed the way we do tariffs. For a long time, the WTO did tariffs by commodity. So there's a thing called the homogenized commodity code system. It has over 10,000 products. Each product goes down to a 10-digit product. It gets more and more precise as you go through the numbers. And every country signed up to the WTO got the same tariff. So once you've published your harmonized system codes, if you were going to sell clothing to the UK, you'd be paying 12% tariffs. And it doesn't matter if the clothing comes from India or China or the US or wherever else. That's the price. However, Trump has turned that on its head because he's realized that not all countries were playing fair. Just as the UK has tariffs on clothing, we've also got a huge amount of tariffs on food. And that's a bit ridiculous because the UK, even now, imports 35% of the food it consumes. And you would think that a country that it has to import 35% of the food it consumes, that's 1/3 of the food it consumes, that we would import it at least tariff-free. But no, we put massively high tariffs on it. In fact, even with the extra 10% that the US has put onto its tariffs, ours are basically on food about double. You know, we're putting 55% tariffs on beef coming in from the US, which is why none of it does come in from the US. And theirs is about 20% with the 10% added. You know, it is just a bizarre situation that the UK has so screwed up its tariffs that it puts high tariffs on goods it doesn't produce efficiently and low or zero tariffs on goods that it does. Our biggest industries, the transport industry, which is making plane parts, are mainly exported around the world, and we have put zero tariffs on imports. So we don't try and protect our aircraft production, Rolls-Royce engines, at all. BA can import Boeing engines for zero tariffs. We're not worried about that because we know those products are so good without tariffs that they've never needed tariffs. But good industries that cannot survive, like our clothing industry, which is pretty much gone, our farming industry, which only does a few commodities at certain times of the year, we put massive tariffs on everyone else's that's imported. And the importance of changing the tariff system from the product to the country is a great way of evening out the present geopolitical problems. Because we realized during COVID, and this is the UK I'm talking about, but it also happened in the US, that we were getting a huge amount of really important strategic parts of products were coming in from China, and China ceased to be a reliable provider. Yes, they closed a lot of factories, and so we didn't get semiconductors. The semiconductors we couldn't get are not the high-end ones. They're pretty basic ones. They go into cars. They cost about $600 per semiconductor. But one $600 missing chip can stop a 60,000-pound car from being exported. And that is madness, and yet that's what we've done. We've allowed industries that we don't really value to move to other countries, but then we suddenly realize if we don't get them, we're in trouble. The same thing happened with pharmaceutical active ingredients. One of our biggest exports is pharmaceuticals, but though we make the nice packaging and we do a lot of the research and development and we invent these drugs, we rely on China to actually make the active ingredients. And they can make it very cheaply, and that's all well and good, until you can't get the active ingredient, because no amount of packaging will make up for the fact that inside those pills is missing the active ingredient. So we really did box ourselves in. Trade is great, and I would love to see completely free trade, but you cannot get completely free trade unless you also have completely free economics. Like, you can't have the present green regulations, you can't have the wages and benefits and stuff that making things here more expensive compared to your competitors. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what size tariff you put on, it'll always be cheaper to bring it in from somewhere where they have much lower wages, no green regulations, and cheap energy costs. So no amount of tariff is going to make up that difference. But meanwhile, you have to trade with people you can trust to be there and keep supplying you with goods. And we have discovered, and Trump has spelt this out wide, you can't rely on your enemies to supply you with important goods, whether it's the antibiotics you need in your medicine or the steel you need to make your defense industry's stuff or your computer chips that's going to control that defense industry.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure you've got lots more to say.
I know. Sorry. I can go on and on.
Bill.
Yeah, I'll give an example of the short-term effects of tariffs. I have a friend who makes branded coffee mugs. Oh, better? Like branded coffee mugs. So like if your company has coffee, has the logo on the coffee mug, he might make that. Typically, and for years, his model has been the goods are made in China. They're then shipped to a U.S. middleman who would do the branding, and then they go out. When tariffs came, it devastated that industry. And so he did what you have to do when you have something devastating in the industry. He looked under every rock trying to figure out, how do I make up for this? And it turned out the only way he could make up the loss from tariffs was to cut out the U.S. middleman entirely and have the Chinese do the branding. In fact, the Chinese manufacturers who normally wouldn't take his orders, they would only take bigger orders, thought it was a golden opportunity to knock out the U.S. middleman. So they actually are now taking happy to finish his product, send it to him. Takes a little bit longer, but it's actually cheaper than it was before tariffs. So he didn't actually counteract the tariffs, but the workaround was to cut out the U.S. entirely. I think that's, if you look at tariffs in the short term, you see a lot of stories like that. You have tariffs on China on our soy, and now our soybean farmers are having trouble, and we may need to bail them out. And certainly in the short term, it had a pretty chaotic effect on the market. I think the market's finally realizing with Trump, you can't just react to everything he says. It's usually he's usually negotiating, so you should wait till he's done negotiating before you freak out. So there's there's certainly, and it certainly can drive up prices, and so there's all kinds of issues with it, but as she was saying, Trump's been using it to get some wins. Some say that holding out tariffs may have had an impact on getting NATO members to invest more. He's entered into big deals with Big Pharma to get manufacturing done in the United States to address the fact that we were paying 3 times as much for medicines. He's been able to use it as an instrument to try to address other issues that are creating unfair trade and unfair pricing. So I think that's been pretty effective. I think it could be more effective if it was combined with a more thought out immigration policy. If we fixed our educational system, we went back to having professional training. I think there's some cultural issues, like the U.S. has gotten away from, that people always say nobody wants to do those jobs anymore. That's a problem. So I think for tariffs to fulfill their potential, I think, I think it's probably a decade or decades long process, but I do think it's been very effective. It just has some kind of short-term interesting impacts.
Okay. Thanks very much, Bill. William.
Thanks very much. Good to be here. Can everyone hear? Yeah, good. I'm the softest spoken politician in the country. Apologies. So the question is there a case for tariffs today? I say yes, absolutely. I think trade protectionism in general is legitimate and can be effective. And I'll use 6 examples to try and make my case. But the first thing I'm going to say is a concession, actually. I'm going to concede that international trade is desirable and necessary, and it boosts global welfare. I don't think there's any doubt about that. However, I think it's a mistake to advocate total free trade at all times and in all places. Why? Because at certain times and in certain places, tariffs or protection do benefit certain economies. And I think we should remember economic history here. The United States grew to become the biggest industrial power behind a tariff wall. And post-war, South Korea is the best example I can find of a modern industrial economy being built from behind tariff walls. So those policymakers in those places found tariffs very useful, and it worked. Secondly, my advocacy of some tariffs and some trade protection is not ideological. If I thought that total unfettered free trade it would be good for this country, I would advocate it. So I'm not an ideologue on this. My case for it is based on national interest. As I say, I'd support free trade if I thought total free trade if I thought it was good for the country. And I don't think this is anything new. I think there have been politicians that have taken this line, and the best one I can think of is F.E. Smith, my favourite Edwardian Tory, who said in 1912 in Chatham in a speech, "It is a waste of time to consider where we stand as between free trade and protection. We are offered no such choice. We must choose between protection and one-sided free imports. Confronted with such alternatives, if this indeed be the choice, I am a protectionist." So he was only a protectionist because he thought it was good for the country. That's my point. Third, this is my biggest point of all, the biggest point and the key point and the overriding point. I think we have to face up to the fact that Britain and the United States have a massive trade problem. Massive trade problem because you have persistent trade deficits year after year, in fact, decade after decade. And the reason that it's a problem, and I think it's wrong for free trade purists to be indifferent to this, is that you accumulate losses. And you do that on just basic trade economics. You can only pay for imports in three ways. You can export something, you can sell something you already have, or you can issue debt. And literally at the end of doing that for a long time, your net international investment position deteriorates and you beggar the country. That is what's happening. And politically, that's what's happening in the States. The reason that Trump and his vice president are so keen on tariffs is that they represent and see the industrial devastation that's taking place. And those people need representing, and he does so. So, as I say, it's just, to prioritize cheap imports year after year and have trade deficits year after year, I think is to prioritize flow over stock. And in the end, it prioritizes consumption over wealth. Real wealth is what you're left with at the end of it, not what you're consuming. I would say it's a bit like selling your house to buy beer. Nice in the short term. So my other key point on this is that you're not going to correct this massive trade problem that we have by pursuing the very same policies that got you into it. So I would look at the relatively low tariffs we've had historically for the last 30 years, GATT and the WTO, and I would say if you want more of that, or you want to be in the single market, which for the single market for Britain was devastating industrially. It's like a big boxing ring, and if you're not a heavyweight, you will just deindustrialize. All of the peripheral economies have deindustrialized. So you can't continue. You've got to look at it and say, well, how do we correct this? And I think tariffs do have consequences. I've always been one to admit there are trade-offs. I think you've got to be fair about that. Prices could increase, other effects. But if you want to deal with this massive chronic trade deficit, you've got to deal with it. Fourth point, cheap goods are more costly than you think. So I think, as I say, for 40 years we've run this experiment with light or tariff-free imports, and we've deindustrialized. And the cost to this country, particularly from the Midlands and the North, is deindustrialization. And whatever benefits you thought you had from this trade liberalization have imposed massive costs on society and those towns and cities. And so you look at there was a panel earlier on today about the state the British economy is in. One of the biggest problems is the state is very big, but it's mopping up the blood. The welfare costs of having 20% of your population unemployed or out of work, and the drug dealers have moved in, you have deaths of despair. This is what happens if you deindustrialize on the back of these policies. I think that's been a mistake. And if you look at the whole picture, it's not worth it. You may have the cheap goods, but possibly you should have kept some of the factories open. Fifth, as I say, I've conceded that free trade produces cheaper goods. I think it does. No one can doubt that. But to prioritize price over everything else, which is a point that Catherine concedes in most debates that we have, and I think she's right, it's not all about price. It's also about security of supply. And if you haven't picked that up, you haven't been paying attention to what happened in the pandemic. Or just look at the security situation of fettering your industry, deindustrializing, and becoming a complete vassal state, reliant on a state that may not have your best interests at heart. China might have China's best interests at heart and not yours. So it's not all about price. It's about security as well. Sixth, this is a key point as well. Free trade isn't necessarily fair trade. And we don't talk about this enough. But if you're interested in buying cheap goods, you've got to be aware that some of those cheap goods will be made using modern slavery or environmental standards that just don't exist. I think getting rid of all environmental standards and producing cheaper industrial goods is a form of protectionism in itself. But you've got to ask yourself a question. Is it right that British workers should compete with people that are paid pittance wages or slave wages abroad? I don't think it is, and I don't think it's morally justified or economically justified. And I think that's the final point. So to finish, I would say our current system of international trade has created huge economic imbalances. I'm not advocating boneheaded trade wars or autarky, or what Kevin Hicks pulls my leg and says, Will, you're talking about a Benite siege economy. I'm not talking about that, really. But what I am saying is that modern democracy should have a chance, to a greater extent they have, to make their own social and economic bargains. And if that means keeping Port Talbot steelworks open for the right of our workers and our energy security and our steel security strategically, then we should do it. And I think there's a paradigm shift, which Trump represents. We'll probably get into that. I wouldn't advocate everything he does, but there is a paradigm shift away from global free trade, which is quite utopian, towards a more local approach. And I welcome that. But to finally answer the question, is there a case for tariffs today? Absolutely. And actually, for the reasons I've mentioned, but also virtually every state in the world applies tariffs. So there's your answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, finally, Phil.
Thanks, Rob. Well, we've heard a good range of economic, geopolitical arguments for and against tariffs. I think we are focusing on tariffs rather than free trade, but I'm sure that'll come up later. So I'm going to approach the question from a different way by looking at what is the problem that we're trying to fix with tariffs. And so I suppose I'm really answering William's third argument that Britain has a massive trade problem. And I think it's important to start with what the problem is, because fixing anything that isn't working, the British economy, has to start with a convincing diagnosis. Otherwise, the suggested remedy, tariffs, could be wrong and could even make the problem worse. So it's like with healthcare. We all have anecdotes of situations where somebody's gone to see a doctor, wrongly diagnosed, given the wrong treatment, and lo and behold, they get iller. Well, I think that's the perspective to have on this. Since import tariffs are supposed to work as a constraint in some way on imported goods, this suggests that the economic problem we're trying to deal with is the flow of imports as a prominent cause of industrial stagnation. And I've yet to see that, I've seen it asserted, but I've yet to see that persuasively demonstrated. Not just today, but actually anywhere. Now, in contrast, many commentators on the economy explain that Britain's prime economic challenge is at home, not from abroad. That stagnant living standards, too many poor quality jobs, they ultimately derive from the inadequacy of business investment in new technologies, combined with the muted reallocation of resources and people away from declining lower productivity sectors into higher productivity ones. And that's certainly in line with this week's trio of Nobel Prize winners, which may have been discussed in other economy sessions today. But all of that trio explain low growth in Britain and other mature economies, with an emphasis on domestic cultural barriers to innovation and on the importance of creative destruction at home. And they explain that for most of the 200 years or so from the Industrial Revolution through to the 1960s broadly, previously when businesses and sectors closed down, new, more productive ones opened up, providing better jobs, which is why employment always continued to increase. Now, what was different with the wave of deindustrialization here in the 70s and the 1980s was that few resources were reallocated to new businesses and new sectors, possibly with the exception, you could say, of North Sea oil and gas. And as a result, business investment slowed. Now, this explanation of Britain's economic slowdown is linked to a long-running weakening of business dynamism, of closures and openings, and that poses, I think, a crucial timing issue for anyone who sees imports as a prime driver of falling investment and of productivity growth. Blaming the external factor of imports doesn't fit with the economic history. British heavy industries, consumer goods industries like televisions, washing machines, and the car industry were all in decline, at least since the 1970s. You could have an argument about when, but well before anyone would date the upswing of world trade, the upswing in world trade, usually known as globalization. Moreover, the contraction of British business investment from the 1980s, when it really accelerated, was also long before the so-called China shock of cheaper Chinese imports, which only really took off in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. So therefore, I'd argue it's incumbent on supporters of tariffs to explain away that inconvenient economic history if they are to be able to establish that it's exposure to foreign goods that primarily drives Britain's economic problems. So what I've said, though, just highlights, I think, the foundational point that a wrong diagnosis of a problem, British stagnation, can lead to an irrelevant remedy. But I think it's worse than that, because I think the circumstances of Britain's specific economic malaise is one where tariffs are one of those solutions that actually make the plight worse, because they're another tool of the state which acts, even unintentionally, to sustain domestic atrophy. Protectionism, and the clue is in the word, protects existing business. And this is, I think, the fundamental paradox of all protectionist measures like tariffs. Businesses, and Catherine explained this well, businesses that are commercially viable, and there's still lots of them in Britain, Rolls-Royce, she explained, British Aerospace, AstraZeneca, Dyson, number of successful companies, these firms should be able to thrive without state protection of tariffs. And in fact, the impact of tariffs would only be negative, because when these cosseted businesses, cosseted by tariffs, become a bit too comfy and a bit too complacent, they are therefore less innovative. And that's the point that one of this week's prize winners, Philippe Aghion, made when he explained that erecting tariff barriers means, quote, domestic firms lose the incentive to innovate to compete more effectively with imported goods at home. Thus, I'd argue, tariffs are detrimental to successful businesses. And on the other side of the paradox is that if businesses are not profitable here, then why are they worthy of state protection? You know, the consequence of supportive tariffs will be to keep zombie firms alive, which itself impairs business dynamism, preventing resources flowing into the prospering parts of the economy. To conclude, I think the discussion about tariffs then, what I'm trying to make out, what I'm trying to explain, is not just a debate on the pros and cons of a particular economic policy. They should rest on a compelling diagnosis that the source of the constraints on productivity growth in a particular country is primarily derived from something outside the national borders, namely imports, rather than from a problem inside. So if there were external problems which were the main threat, then imposing some sort of control at the border might make sense. But if they're mainly internal problems, then an import barrier is at best irrelevant, or worse, damaging by taking our attention away from confronting those domestic barriers and allowing them to fester, or, as I say, worse still, actually aggravating the problems at home. So that's my specific concern about tariffs and protectionist tariffs. They shield a huge cohort of low productive, unviable businesses from experiencing the commercial pressures and incentives which they need to prosper, and thus they prop up an already stagnant economy. This does no one at home any good. Does consumers no good? Does businesses no good? Rather, I think tariffs are acting historically and today, the proposals, as another self-harming, domestically created obstacle that actually impedes the long overdue restructuring and revitalization of industry, which I know we all share as an objective.
Thank you very much. So I think that's all kind of set out the stall for it. This is a session that's called about tariffs, but it's kind of not about tariffs really, except in the sense of, are tariffs the answer to the problem that we're trying to solve? So firstly, how do we revive the British economy and certain sectors like British industry, which generally people say we'd like to have more industry in this country because it's productive and it produces well-paid jobs. But are there other factors we need to take into account? Things like security, as we've seen with COVID, or in a world that's getting a bit scarier. Maybe we need to make sure that we can get everything either at home or from friendly countries. So the floor is yours now. We've got a hand down here at the front. We've got two hands down here at the front. Where's the microphones? There we go. So do you two, please.
Stand up.
Thanks. Catherine, if I heard you correctly, I heard that there was some guarded sympathy for the Independence Day Trump tariff plan. It's been argued that this is a bold negotiating tactic. But given that the net economic cost of tariffs is it makes consumers poorer by raising costs and prices, it makes manufacturing businesses less competitive by raising their input costs, what sane negotiating tactic begins with, give me what I want, or I'll make my consumers poorer and my manufacturing businesses less competitive?
Thank you. Yeah.
Another question for Catherine. So, on the point of farming, you're saying that tariffs is basically keeping these unproductive sectors unproductive by not exposing them to the market forces. But that's sort of the point to an extent, because when we talk about security again, farming food, that's a sovereign capability. We need the ability to make our own food. So when it comes to, say, the farming sector, or even to extend the steel sectors, not completely irrelevant, but it's almost irrelevant to whether they're that productive or not. We need to have that capability in this country. And if we was to loosen these massive tariffs that we have on the farming sector, then it would almost certainly dissipate for the most part. And then we lose the ability to feed ourselves. And we lose the ability to feed ourselves, then what sovereignty or do we have in this country?
Okay, great. That's a great question. So I've got hand there and then a hand right at the back over there.
A question to Phil. If you were to reverse the argument about zombie industries in the UK and apply it to French farming, for example, which is arguably a zombie industry and massively supported by the EU and the French government, they can't change the CAP, they keep trying to. And the same thing with Chinese industries that are massively underpinned and supported by the Chinese government with tariff barriers and all sorts of other interventions. If you're operating in a world like that, why shouldn't Britain be free to do that too?
Great. Hand at the back there.
Well, my question arises from Phil's contribution, but it's for all panelists. And it's because I'm not understanding Phil's argument, because it seems to me, Phil, you're saying that the problem with tariffs is that it kills competition and market forces, and hence it means that you sustain zombie industries. And I'm having trouble understanding that. Let's just take an example of, say, we imposed very high tariffs on all our farming produce. So, yes, we would be protecting our farmers from competition from France, Germany and Italy and so on. But you would still have farmers in Britain competing against each other. You would still have free reign of market forces operating on Farmer Giles, who grows his potatoes in Somerset, against every other farmer, not just in Somerset, but every other county in the United Kingdom. So why is that not the approach which we can adopt to protect certain industries and farming and so on either strategic grounds and or simply because we think this is what a fully rounded economy should have? I just don't follow your argument entirely about killing off market forces.
Okay, there was a hand at the back. Yeah, and then I'll come back to the panel. I'll maybe start with Bill and come along. So anyway.
Regardless of whether you're pro-free trade or protectionism or think we need more state-led industrial policy, in the context of Britain, what kind of industries do you imagine we could encourage? I mean, can we all be employed mass employed by AstraZeneca? Can we compete with Bangladeshi textile workers in terms of wages and things like this? What vision have you got? Because I find it very hard to imagine.
Right, great. Okay, so we've got, this is just raising costs for consumers and firms. Doesn't seem like much of a negotiating tactic. I guess it's a security question about farming. I mean, if we can't grow our own food and we can get it all cheaper from elsewhere, but doesn't that leave us in the lurch? So same with fairness of competition as well. So fair trade rather than free trade, which has already been mentioned, and what kind of vision we think we're creating of a future economy, and isn't there already internal competition that isn't that good enough in terms of forcing firms to innovate and so on? So don't try and answer all of those, but Bill, your thoughts on any of that?
It's tricky because it's really hard to measure the impact on all of these things, and it's hard to measure what's fair. For example, Trump talked about reciprocity, but are we really ever going to have a trade reciprocity with Vietnam? Like, are they going to buy as many of our goods as we're going to buy of theirs? Of course not. So it's difficult to measure it. I also think it's hard to imagine it's okay for, the one comment I make on the zombie stuff is if China is clearly doing protectionism, clearly doing subsidies, and they have a lot of companies that are not zombies that are doing very well. So it seems one-sided that it's good for them, but it's bad for us. But I actually have a question as well for Phil, and I'm curious because to me, what would be intervention that you think would help companies innovate rather than turn them into zombies? In other words, if it's not tariffs, would it be subsidies? What kind of intervention would you advocate for to protect the critical industries?
Okay, Catherine.
There's a lot there, but I'll just quickly do the others, and I'm coming back here. Weirdly, our most efficient export of agricultural goods is whiskey. It's counted as an agricultural goods. It has 0 tariffs internationally. No one has ever put tariffs on most of those hard alcohols because they were traded for hundreds of years. And our second biggest one is chocolate biscuits. And weirdly, that is because we used to be able to import the cocoa from one colony, the sugar from a different colony, and the wheat from Canada, and mix it all together and make an amazing chocolate biscuit like a Kit Kat, or some of you may be old enough to remember Roundtrees and Cadbury Schweppes. They all used to be made in the UK. And it was made because we had free trade with all of our colonies, so we could get all of these ingredients. And none of those colonies had the other ingredients. So they didn't actually make them themselves. They just sent all the goods to us and we made them here. That said, the reason I disagree with Phil is because he's talking about a fantasy land that doesn't exist. One of the greatest things ever written is the USTR report on global trade barriers. And this is where I'm coming back to you. Even Singapore has trade barriers. Even countries that we hold up as the beacon of free trade, Singapore puts 80% import tariff on beer. Okay, which is why it's forced all companies that make beer in Singapore was made there. So, whatever brand you're drinking when you go to Singapore, it was made in Singapore because no one can afford to put 80% tariffs on beer. Though the USTR was more concerned about the non-tariff barriers that Singapore has on its finance industry, where it demanded that if you set up a bank in Singapore, a proportion of all of the people on the board and the people working in the bank had to be Singaporeese citizens and things like that. And that is the real problem. For years and years and years, the US that did set up the whole GATS, which became the WTO, they had very, very low tariffs on everything. They were hugely encouraging to help the rest of the world develop. And a lot of it may have been self-servicing because I did know a company that wasn't exporting agricultural goods around the world because most of the rest of the world couldn't afford them. So I knew a guy in Australia who got the rights to export to the rest of the world. The US manufacturer was not interested because he thought it was more time than it was going to be worth. And that was the problem. The US was so much richer than everyone else that they didn't bother putting tariffs on anyone else's. But that has all changed. And most of the countries that they are now putting tariffs on have traditionally had very high tariffs and non-tariff barriers on US goods. So they've kept these things out. Yes, it does increase cost to consumers. And this may be more obvious in the US. But in the UK, we wouldn't even notice. Because as I said, this jacket had 12% VAT on, 12% tariffs on it, but that was on the import price. And the import price is usually a tiny fraction of what you pay for something when you go to a shop. And in the shop, you pay 20% on VAT, which is more than any other person in the chain got out of that. The government who sits around doing nothing, they got 20%. Meanwhile, there's an importer who had to pay the 12%, and then he had to send it on to a distributor or a wholesaler who would send it to the shop. The shop's obviously got to pay the rent. He's got to pay the wages. He's got to pay inventory costs. He's got to store all this stuff waiting for someone like me to come along and buy the jacket in black in my size. He's got every other size and every other color stuff somewhere in the back room. That costs a fortune, especially with the interest rates now. And so the idea that the tariff on the little bit at the beginning is the killer is a nonsense if you're going to keep all the other costs up. But in America, a lot of states, and there's no federal VAT, a lot of states don't even have a retail sales tax. So it will be felt because they've had years and years of not having all of these tariffs. So I understand that it's going to upset a lot of people in the US, but they are now going to get to live like Europeans. And all of those people that read the New York Times have always wanted to be Europeans, so now they'll be able to understand that the reason we can't sell things here is because our government puts too much tax on them. And that's why every company in Europe is so horrified that their goods are taxed when they go to the US. Because for years, that was their big market, because it was actually cheaper to buy a BMW in New York than it was in Germany. And that is entirely because of the European governments, and European in the big sense, I include the UK in that. We just put taxes on consumption. It's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. If you want to run an economy based on consumption, you've got to make it cheap. And the idea that we're taxing consumption and then complaining there's no growth in the society is a bit like, well, duh, what did you expect? So there.
Okay, Phil, thanks. What intrigues me from our platform discussion, but just generally when I'm discussing these issues, is that it comes across, people say, oh, outrageous what you're saying, fantasy economics or whatever. Yeah. I am saying absolutely nothing original. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What I'm simply explaining is what Adam Smith discovered and wrote about in The Wealth of Nations 250 years ago. What he said was that this protectionist, mercantilist rubbish from medieval times isn't actually economic very, very useful, nor is it in the national interest of British people. That actually, if you put up barriers to flows of trade, it causes difficulties, and we've already heard lots of them. And so his argument was that we don't just live in lots of different nation states, John, right, where market forces can work. He said, hey, we've got a world economy now. We've got something whereby we've got a possibility of doing things better than in our own tiny little villages and districts and countries. There can be an international division of labour. And that was the orthodoxy for a long time. The mercantilism was bad. Trying to simply protect yourself behind boats, navies, and tariffs and all sorts of barriers was a damaging process. And that if you could take advantage of relatively international free trade, that was a good thing. It was an international division of labour. People could, different countries, different climates, different raw material resources that you have, countries can specialise in different areas. And that was a thing which he argued could create rising living standards. That was a theory. Actually, it worked out in practice for a long time. His argument was actually reinforced by the Industrial Revolution, which then allowed, once it spread to other countries from Britain and France and elsewhere, countries could specialize in different industrial products, not just those which were based on their natural attributes. And that broadly has worked to increase living standards in many countries, not in all, for a couple of hundred years. And yet now, this is what I'm saying is apparently a fantasy situation. The two arguments used. One is that, Catherine, you're saying, but really, these tariffs on my jacket, my clothes, they're really pretty tiny things, There's lots of other problems. Believe me, I know there are a lot bigger problems than, 8% tariffs on that. But it's like, I'll use you, James, as an example. Here's James over here, a good friend of mine. He's broken his leg in 3 places, right? It's causing him a lot of immobility problems. So do you say it's okay, James, you can whack your other foot and make it a bit painful so you can't hop? It's not a big problem having a little pain on your other leg. But I say, well, why? Why do you want to hurt his other leg, even if it's a tiny bit? He's got a much bigger problem than that. But you don't add to the problems by saying, we'll add in bits and bits of tariffs, because I say they don't resolve any problem. They may not be the biggest problem, Gareth, I agree with you, but they still make things worse. They still make living standards higher, may only a little bit higher, but it's still higher. And that leads me to the other argument, which I had a little chuckle when William ended, when he said, everybody uses tariffs. Yes, I know that everybody uses tariffs. But is that an argument for inflicting damage on yourself? France uses tariffs. China uses tariffs. Yes, all the world uses tariffs. But if everyone is shooting themselves in the foot, why do you say, I'm also going to shoot myself in the foot? Because tariffs actually make domestic problems worse, at least in today's conditions. I'm willing to have a debate about, the development of a particular, car industry in some third world country that was developing and did a bit of infant industries protection, support them for a few years. I'm prepared to have that discussion because you say, yes, that particular situation, the problem was external. But the problem is not external now. It's not China. It's not cheap goods. The problem is internal to a lot of Western countries. And adding tariffs on is just another way of aggravating the domestic barriers to actually innovating and growing.
Okay, William? I totally disagree with that. I'll try and knock it down the best I can. I'll try and use some examples, actually, which will go back to the Trump thing. So let's look at a specific example, Chinese electric vehicles, which in the European market, in this market in the UK, are about a third cheaper than anything that's produced domestically. The third cheaper, right? Now, our reaction, we've got the worst policy on this in the world. It's a policy that Phil would like, which is zero tariff. So we get the cars cheap, and as a result, more Chinese EVs get sold every single year. And in the end, I think it'll gobble up the whole market. People might be sentimental about buying British or whatever, but not when a third on a price, a high ticket item like that. They're just going to have a lot. Now, and we also mandate this, because you've got Miliband mandating people to buy these things, and we don't have any tariffs. So it's utterly crazy policy. Let's look at the United States. What do they do about EVs? Well, Trump put 50% on, and Biden put 100. Good for Biden. Biden was actually 20 years ago. Biden was pretty SDP. I think he was absolutely cracking. But so basically, he's got 100% on. The European Union have a sort of it's a more complex system, but it's up to 47% on EVs. They're practicing protection because, and this is the difference between us. Just get this: they're not being ideological about it. If they took Phil's idea, they'd have none, and the Chinese would eat your whole market. Totally. You wouldn't make any cars. You just wouldn't make any cars. And I'm asking you, do you think that's sensible? And by the way, when Trump increased tariffs, Sean Fain, who's president of the United Auto Workers Union in the United States, praised Trump and said this is the end of a 30-year plus free trade disaster that's devastated the working class. Now, he's representing his auto workers, and I happen to think he's right.
I read a very interesting article about this a couple of weeks ago, making the point that everybody says, "Oh, foreign imports destroyed Detroit." That's the, and making the point. No, those jobs moved elsewhere in the US because auto manufacturers were actually sick of the UAW crippling their production. And so they just moved to places that weren't so heavily unionized. And actually America makes just as many cars as it used to. But I think that this thing about, but what if the other guys aren't playing fair, is a really, really big issue. I mean, we saw it yesterday with the debate about rare earths. China has subsidized rare earths, these very important trace metals that are used in everything. China's been subsidizing them to sell below cost for 30 years, and nobody else can afford to make them economically because it just doesn't make sense. They wouldn't be able to sell them if they could produce them. So what do we think about that when there is such a strategic decision by one government to do that, and they're not playing fair? Then does that change the whole free trade tariff question, or do we think, hey, they're giving us cheap rare earths? Brilliant. That's good news for us and for our industry. So anyway, more thoughts from you. All right, there we go. Right, so I've got one right at the back and then one in the middle here, and then I shall go over that side as well. Right, okay. Yeah.
So not so long ago, the left liberal establishment was cheering for tariffs. They called them climate tariffs or carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And then tariffs were okay, even appreciated. I think this idea is pretty much dead, but how do you see the potential developments in this area? I'm keen to hear the opinion of the panel. Thank you.
Okay, and we've got a hand in the middle there.
Thank you. My question is just about security and whether if we have over-reliance on potential geopolitical enemies, whether there should be some form, in some way, of risk premium attached to that. So I used to work in international banking, and you would manage your exposure to different industries, financial products, regions, countries. You might also do that in managing your own share portfolio. You might manage that to make sure you're not overexposed in any area in particular. So are there mechanisms apart from tariffs, or is there, does the panel think there's necessary to have any sort of management of overexposure to any countries? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just here, yeah.
Hi, I'm generally with Phil on the benefits of comparative advantage. I think we should work with that. I'm a bit perplexed with you, Catherine. I was a staunch Brexiteer, as I believe you were. Let's get out of this protectionist racket called the EU. And now you appear to be defending protectionist policies, as far as I can see. So if you'd expand on that, I'd be interested.
Okay, and just next to you, the man with the bad leg.
I just wanted to fault my friend William Clouston, who won't remember me, but I remember him.
Of course I do.
Well, and that is, does anybody know which divided peninsula had a northern component that was wealthier than the southern component for a number of years? That's a good riddle. The answer is Korea. North Korea was bigger than South Korea, and South Korea had nothing in the late 40s and early 50s. And William, I don't know whether you let this slip or if anybody else noticed it, but you felt that South Korea's takeoff was due to its imposition of tariffs. Partly. Well, I put it to you that the repression of the South Korean working class, which was covered in a great essay with really daunting photographs by the Financial Times, of all people, just this past week, is what explains the takeoff of Korea. I put it to you that the criminalization of the trade unions, the Cold War atmosphere, the repressive dictatorships, that's what led, not tariffs, to South Korea's growth. When it started off, what was the main export of South Korea? Does anybody know that riddle? The answer is wigs. They were big in the wig. But, you know, what explains the escape is, you know, something entirely different, which has not come up in the session, which is what are the domestic conditions? It's rather important in the future of war. Right? What are the domestic conditions with the working class? One final small point, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, trips off the tongue so easily, is alive and well and coming into the EU, I believe, in January. Catherine is nodding, that's good enough for me, and it's going to further tighten the protectionist screw. So I don't mind if the state, and I'd like Phil to say more about this, follows Adam Smith and prepares the basic conditions for industry, not least research and development. Laboratories, like Keir Starmer, whose father was a laboratory worker. That doesn't seem to have occurred to people, And yeah, sure, the state should get into that. And it hasn't bothered very much, especially public expenditure on R&D, especially in the United States. There is a big role for the state. So let's be nuanced about this.
Okay, so once again, we need to go for a working class suppressing dictatorship. That's the way to solve our economic problems. Anyway, we've got a couple over here, and then I'll come back to the panel again, and I'll start with William this time.
Just a simple question. In terms of using trade policy in terms of security, don't we first need to know who our enemies actually are? We don't seem to work that out in this country.
Very good question.
Yeah, and just, was there another hand there? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Go. There we go.
Thank you. I think a lot of the questions that have been coming up have been hinting towards a phrase that nobody's used, I don't think, on the panel, which is the national interest. And I think the criticism I would have of your proposal, Phil, is that what you seem to be prioritising over everything is global most efficiency and most cheapness. Now, that strikes me as one of those things like global warming or any of those things where you put the planet above the interests of an individual country. And I actually think the British national interest is something that is important, and it's something we should talk about. And I think if you go out and talk to people about, what they think the national interest is, and I don't think it's very obvious in some of these areas, because I think you have to balance lots of different things. But I think some people might say, I'd be happy to protect our farmers because they are the stewards of our countryside, and I like going to the countryside. They might say, I think some industries we should protect because we want security in production of steel or weapons or anything, something like that. I think some people might say that. I think some people might say it's right to protect our skills and the ability of our younger people to be trained and be able to, do all the things that they need to. And I think lots of people might put those things above cheap goods and efficiency at a global scale. So I think we need to have that conversation. We're not having that conversation. Let's have that conversation. And then, as you say, you've got to describe the problem. Well, let's talk to people about what they think the problem is. And they might not come back with efficiency.
Okay, right. So, William and Phil and everybody, pick up on what you want to.
Oh, so there's a lot there. Thank you. So the first point on sort of carbon taxes and so on, I'd just like to move from that to just observe the fact that the UK's domestic policy in energy is basically subcontracting all of our renewable capacity to the Chinese state. I think that's utterly crazy, mad. You just shouldn't do that. It doesn't last forever, and when it wears out in 15 years' time, what will you do? So I think that's the sort of foolishness. There's a difference between cost and value, which is what Hillary was getting at. I may as well mention it now because I wanted to mention it. Hillary's point about farming and has come up more broadly. Sheep. The future of areas of the country that I live in, Northumberland, but Cumbria, Northumberland, all of the upland farms that have sheep on them, the question of whether they will still have a mutton industry is not for us now. It's for the Australians. As Catherine's lot will decide whether we have these sheep. And it really will, because the FTA we did with Australia, it's not immediate, but in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, if the Australians wanted to take our sheep industry out, they could do, on cost, they could do it. Now, they might well decide to sell to Saudi Arabia, as they do in China. There might be better markets, but the choice is theirs. I think it's, again, from the national interest, very foolish thing to do, just to sign an FTA that is yet another shoe that will drop. We lost the fishing industry. We lost, domestically produced nuclear, gone. A lot of our industries just go because of indifference. And by the way, the South Koreans are not indifferent. They're very protectionist about their corporations. I mean, you would never get on energy, for instance. You'd never. It's a slightly complex system, private and public, but it isn't foreign owned. It is not foreign owned. They know what their interest is, and they back it. And finally, I just want to make the point. I get challenged quite a lot on, do these things work? Do tariffs work? I always concede that it changes pricing, and it can take a few years for different macroeconomic pipe work and trade networks to replug. I always give that away. But ultimately, it does work. I mean, if a state like Singapore decides that a Singer or Tiger beer is going to be made in Singapore, they've put a regulation in and it gets made in Singapore. So every single one of those brewers in Singapore, their employment and their production, their added value that they have is something to do with the policy they put. And another thing, we sort of prove the point every time sanctions are applied. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the EU applied sanctions on food. So they basically stopped supplying them with beef and other agricultural products. What happened? Russia produced those products itself. Now, it wasn't interested in doing so before, but it did. And the SDP often, one of our sort of strap lines is, use brute force. And if brute force isn't working, you're not using enough. Tariffs really work, if you want them to work.
Sounds like you're beating him up. Be careful there, Phil.
Yeah, well, I think we just want to think, what does William mean when he says they work? Yeah, they do work. I'm not saying they're completely irrelevant. They can actually be extremely damaging. It can mean, if you put tariffs on something, that you are restricted to domestic producers who are probably high cost, and it's a narrower range of products. So they do work. They do work against the interests of businesses who are also using those imported costs, and against the interests of consumers. So yeah, they work, but they work in a damaging way. Right. Point about security. I think I've just come from a session when I was explaining exactly the importance of national interest, Spillery, and why national interest isn't, the words you put into my mouth, all about efficiency. I don't believe it is. In fact, that's one of the problems, that national interest, the way we're discussing it today, which is something I'm a wholehearted fan of, and we do not have it in Western countries. The elites do not have a sense of what their national interest is. That's why we have a lot of the geopolitical problems we have today. But national interest isn't economic nationalism, right? National interest isn't just about efficiency. What national interest is about the long-term well-being of the people of a country. And that has three big components. It has a security component, which we'll go on to. It has a prosperity component. It has a social cohesion component, probably a few more there. That sense of what is in the long-term interest of the people who happen to be within the borders of a particular nation, that is what our governments should be pursuing. That's what we should be pursuing, and they don't have a clue at the moment. Trump doesn't have a clue in terms of America, and no do any other Western leaders. I do think in some countries like South Korea, like China, like other parts of East Asia that I'm familiar with, they have a bit more of a sense as to where their long-term interests are, right? But we can't get into that. Security, I say, is one component, but security doesn't come from closing yourself off. I mean, if you're a big country like America, you can go a little bit in that direction. But talk about fantasy, Catherine, I know you're not saying this, but the idea of national self-sufficiency as a means of security is fantasy, right? It hasn't existed since before, the age of exploration, 500 years ago, whenever, people started trading things. The idea you produce everything you need internally and that equates to security is wrong, right? It's completely fallacious. Agriculture has been mentioned, right? The importance of mutton, maybe, the importance of producing foodstuffs. Yeah, that sort of makes sense. But what happens if you're not able to produce certain foodstuffs? Is it advantageous then to build up your protectionist barriers to stop other people exporting their goods at a decent price to you? No, it's actually damaging. It's counterproductive. Look at Singapore, right? Singapore, again, don't have much truck for the sort of rather authoritarian political system, but Singapore has had a strategy as to how to ensure food security, right? people know Singapore. It's a tiny city-state. It doesn't produce much food. It's 90% dependent on imports, and it's regularly up at the top of the league when people say, who has got the highest food security in the world? Singapore. How they've done that with a strategy, state strategy, of actually creating a very diversified range of food producers. And it's they've got something like 100 other countries, minimum, are exporting foodstuffs into Singapore. And if they have a blow up with somebody, or there's a tidal tsunami somewhere else that causes disruption or whatever, they can switch to other suppliers. They have a rational, diversified, foreign source of foodstuffs. That gives them, say, one of the best food securities in the world. So food security does not mean putting up tariffs to stop yourself having any interactions with anyone else. It's about controlling your relationships with the rest of the world. That doesn't mean managed trade. It means controlling your relationships with the rest of the world. And that's what we've lost when we've lost the sense of national interest, and that's what we have to regain.
A lot of things in this. First of all, yes, CBAM is another word for tariff, and that is it. And like a lot of things on the left, when Trump introduced his tariffs on China in his first term, the press went sort of mad. When Biden doubled those tariffs, he didn't get rid of any of them, he doubled them. The press didn't notice because a left-wing tariff isn't real and a right-wing tariff is like, oh, let's lose our hair. And that's CBAM. CBAM actually started in October last year, but they only started the paperwork. They weren't actually introducing the price, because the biggest cost to most industries of CBAM is actually going to be filling in the paperwork, which is horrendous. And our own CBAM was meant to be starting in 2027, and we want to know not just how much the carbon came out of the product we're importing, but also how much carbon was produced during the production of the inputs into that product. So we have to go back 2 generations. That's going to kill us long before the price hits us. But anyhow, we now might join the EU system instead, which will be just as bad because their carbon cost is about twice our carbon cost. And that will hurt us really badly, because our one of the reasons why our industry is having so much trouble competing is not because of a tariff protection, but because our industrial electricity is so much more expensive. It's expensive because we've added a lot of green taxes onto it. And those green taxes are not added onto industrial electricity in the EU. So they are preferring to charge for the carbon through a CBAM rather than on the electricity, but our guys are going to get it on the electricity and on the CBAM. So, you can't leave the EU. Yes, I'm still a Brexiteer, but I'm also on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, and I have actually read all of the trade agreements that we've done. So I can tell William that he's talking rubbish about sheep. And also because I have actually read the trade deals. And that's the real problem, is there is no country in the world, not even Singapore, that does have completely free trade. And I would like us to get out of the EU's orbit. The EU was a customs union, which meant you had free trade within it, and it proved that Ricardo was absolutely correct. Industry moves to the most efficient producer, and in most cases, the most efficient producer was not the UK. So we lost a whole lot of industry to Germany, to France, and then later to Czechoslovakia and Poland. And, we've had the EU actually helped subsidize moving the production of one of the Range Rovers, I think it's the Defender, Land Rover, to Slovakia, I'm going to say. And they moved the Cadbury's chocolate to Poland. We lost whole industries that were being subsidized to move to Eastern European countries, which was part of what the EU said was an inclusion program. With South Korea, James, it was worse than that because they also had really tight monetary restrictions. So you couldn't send money out of the country. You couldn't invest in various things. It was very, very tightly controlled till they built up their industries. But I'm going to defend my country here. Like, This sheep stuff. God, I'd run over and use a bit of brute force on you in a minute.
It's my family too as well. Half of my family.
The two worst trade deals I've ever seen are the US, New Zealand, and the UK, New Zealand, and UK, Australia trade deal. They are so one-sided, and the one side is to the UK. New Zealand dropped all of its tariffs on all of its goods immediately. The day it was signed, they were all gone. The US and New Zealand only exports 9 goods, and they're all agricultural goods. And the UK is keeping tariffs and quotas on all of those goods for another 5 to 16 years. And the sheep is 16 years.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's 16 years' time. It'll be.
And in Australia, they've generously done the 15-year thing on the beef. And I think the sheep is slightly shorter than that. I mean, it's just rubbish. But I still read in the papers that we're being flooded with New Zealand lamb. When the UK joined the EU, they took a 200,000-tonne tariff-free quota under the WTO with them. So the whole time they were members of the EU, they had the ability to import 200,000 tonnes of New Zealand lamb. They never, ever used that amount. Even before we voted to leave, they were importing 90,000 tonnes. Last year, it was only 70,000 tonnes. That is because we have got better at freezing lamb, and when lamb used to be quite seasonal and we'd eat British lamb in the lamb season and New Zealand lamb out of the lamb season, we've now extended the British lamb season so that we eat less of the New Zealand lamb. However, the big problem with the mutton industry in this country is not New Zealand lamb or Australian lamb, which is slightly better, but it's chicken. Chicken used to be a very expensive thing in this country. In the 70s, the average 2-kilo family-sized chicken that was used on the Sunday roast was about 5% of the average weekly wage. It is now about 0.5%. It is so, so cheap, and that has come because chicken is now made in battery farms. It's fed with corn and soybeans, which we import tariff-free. So in a way, chicken, which we put massive tariffs on the actual chicken, unless you import it from Poland when it's tariff-free, but if we import it from almost anywhere else in the world, we put tariffs on it. But we import the grain that we use to feed the chicken tariff-free from South America and the US. So it's kind of a weird idea that we can be self-sufficient in food as well. This idea of, I think that there is a case for tariffs in terms of defence, but you've really got to play to your strengths and look at what you're good at. What the UK is really good at, and they should be playing to, is producing oil, gas and coal. You've got a lot of it. And instead you're putting stupid laws on that. And then you're complaining you need to keep your steel industry open because it's a defence issue. Well, you cannot make steel without importing the iron ore and importing the coal now because you're not using your own coal. So why do you think it's less of a defensive problem to import 2.6 tonnes of raw materials to make 1 tonne of steel than it would be to import the finished steel? You know, it is just a nonsense that we've got this strange idea about defence when we think we can keep importing all the raw materials, and the equivalent of the German U-boats, which will be Chinese drones, I suppose, they won't start bombing all of the ships trying to bring us the iron ore to keep the steel industry going. You know, it is really crazy how we've managed to push ourselves into a corner. We are now even talking about reducing the number of sheep in the sheep herd. So, William, I've got bad news for you. It's going to get worse because of this CO2, even though sheep don't actually burp methane. That's the cows. But they want all animals gone because, as I've said yesterday, you know, DEFRA is pretty much run by vegans. And they don't actually understand that we are importing the soybeans they're eating. You know, personally, I'd put a big tariff on soybeans. But
okay, Bill, any thoughts on that?
I don't have any thoughts on sheep, but one thought is we talk about how you can't just shore, if we're not as efficient, we can't just shore that up, that the issue isn't necessarily tariffs, it's that we're not as efficient. We're not going to go back to child labor, probably. We're not going to give up all regulations. We're not going to go back to allowing complete pollution. So for certain key industries, we got to do something. I certainly don't know what the answer is. I don't know if there is one, but my suspicion is it's a combination of tariffs and subsidies and other kind of strategic priorities. But simply saying, hey, we need to outcompete when we know very well we're not going to do the things that would actually make us competitive, that's not really an answer. The other thought is, and you were making a good point on Biden and Trump. Ironically, the politics on this are very interesting in the U.S. because typically it was a Democrat were in favor of tariffs. Republicans were free trade. From what I'm hearing, there's just nobody wants to talk about it because the Democrats want to agree and the Republicans want to disagree, but neither can do either. So it's a very and there's actually some bipartisan legislation in the works that might say, okay, just do it, but tell us what you're doing, and if we don't agree within a certain time, you'll stop. So it's a very funny issue. The one thing I think from is it's not going anywhere. I think it's too visceral of an issue. Both sides are starting to kind of see it. And also once the government gets its hand on a revenue stream, it's very slow to give it up. So I don't think this is going to go away. I don't think it's Trump. And when people see he can use it to get other things, I just, no one gives up power either. So I think this is here to stay.
Okay, great. So
good point.
The floor is just, we're coming towards the end of the discussion. So quick fire points, got a hand at the back.
There's been a lot of discussion in theory about tariffs or not tariffs. For those who are in favor of tariffs, is there a mechanism by which you calculate what the tariff should be rather than just the fact that it should be one? And once it's in place, and you touched on this a second ago, is there a way that you can protect against regulatory capture and benefiting insiders, politically popular insiders in the long run, once it's there?
Yes.
Yeah, just go back to Phil's point. That I'm not in favour, just to be clear, like, for example, agriculture, that we have complete self-sufficiency. That's just never going to work. We're not going to, be able to grow soybeans completely in this country. There's just some fruits and vegetables you can't grow here. I get that. My point is around tariffs, though, is that when it comes to the sovereign capability, it's about having the capability in the country. It doesn't matter if it makes up 5, 10, or even like 2% of the industry. Having that capability in this country is important. And it's important to have tariffs there to make sure that you keep some sort of residual capability in this country. For example, I think a good example of this is the during COVID, when we had an issue of face masks couldn't get into this country because the French blocked it at Calais. Now, we didn't have any capability to produce any masks whatsoever, and that left us vulnerable. If we had some sort of some capability, however small it was, then in times of emergency, we can scale it up immediately. So that's my point. That's what I was trying to get at.
Okay, great. Far away, yes, you've got the mic.
Yeah, like someone mentioned this idea of there's tariffs only work in a certain circumstances. I'm just interested what you think those certain circumstances are and why they don't work today.
Okay, right. That's everything. So what I'm gonna do is just take the panel again in the original order. So, Catherine, anything you want to pick up? Do you think that we should be sending children back up chimneys and things like that to compete, or any other objectionable views you want to put on the table now?
No, I'm not for putting children back up chimneys, but I would like to see us keep our plastics industry here and our chemical industry here and our pharmaceutical industry here, which are all things that we're A, good at, and B, are offshoots of the oil and gas industry. Because when you crack the long-chain carbohydrates, you get the short-chain ones, which you use into plastics, which we could have used to make masks and gloves if we weren't trying to kill that industry. And that is my point about Brexit, really, is while the EU put that tariff wall around the whole place and we kept out more efficient goods from other countries, we've now put a similar, slightly lower tariff wall. We did lower our tariffs slightly when we left, but not very much. Our government still has a mercantilist view of tariffs, and we've kept our tariffs high on all of the things we can't make and kept them zero or low on all of the things that we can make. And I don't understand it at all. I'm sorry. I just think that's madness. I would be letting in a lot more food from the rest of the world. And if you were going to put a tariff on anything, you might consider protecting the industries that are about to move to the US because we've killed their raw material, which is oil and gas.
Okay, thank you. Bill, final thoughts?
Well, I think there is a formula for how you calculate tariffs. You basically start at 150% and then only lower it if they do what you want. I'll leave it there. But
okay, thank you, William.
Just to sum up, yeah, I think it's been an interesting debate. I think what a lot of this, I always think that economics is what you can produce and politics is who gets what. And I think nothing has changed in this debate, basically. Over hundreds of years, it's producers against consumers. I think we've gone too far on consumption, cheap goods, rule everything. And we've got manufacturing down at 9% in this country. It's not viable. We can't run this state like this. You've got to build that up. You've got to want to do it up. And one of the reasons I fight so hard on this topic in this country is that the reason that you got tariff reform in the United States is that you had about 20 years of academic agitation, union agitation, and work done by Lighthizer and even Danny Roderick and Fletcher and people, and it didn't come out of nowhere. But in this country, I'm very worried. There's very few people talk about it, and we should. We need to at least think what tariffs might do, what trade protection might do for us before we actually get a viable policy.
Okay, and Phil?
To answer Bill, if you're around, we're doing a session straight after this on what the state should do. And I think it should do an awful lot more, but stay out of the things that it's doing at the moment. So, for an example, cheap energy using the oil and gas, which are in the North Sea, would be a very good start for all industries. So I think there is a lot state can do. I'm not a free marketeer. I think the main sort of question to be more about the sort of self-sufficiency side of things and the security side of things. Could you cope? And I think your question sort of exposes the logical fallacy with that, because what does it mean to maintain a little bit of capacity in every area? I mean, you agree Britain, as a 2% of world production, isn't going to produce everything for 70 million British people. Agreed, yeah. But a little bit of capability in every area. Again, I mean, that's the fantasy, I think. A little bit of capability in steel. Yeah, well, we have that a little bit. How long that's going to last? A little bit of capability in semiconductors, which we don't have. A little bit of capability in, health equipment, we have. But other areas, huge, vast areas that we rely on imports, a little bit of capability in iron ore production. Well, no, we don't. Yeah, a little bit of capability in coal mine. Well, we don't. Then all you're going to do is have a whole panoply of low productivity, relatively inefficient businesses, which isn't going to create what is in the national interest of the people. My argument is every country should concentrate on what it's good at. I understand what Catherine's saying, but there's a slight logic to saying the reality is if your industries are profitable and commercially viable, then yes, they don't need tariffs because they can compete on the world market, right? And the industries that do need tariffs are the ones that we should let go to the side and allow those resources to be moved into the good areas, into the pharmaceuticals, the chemicals, the biosciences, the construction industry, which needs to grow, industries which could be high productivity. Let the resources go into what we need, rather than this nostalgic idea that we should be able to do everything in a little bit. It's a fancy side. Finally, on the geopolitics, I mean, even as a geopolitical tool, it doesn't. I mean, the economic history is it doesn't work, right? It's not the first time we've had trade used as a geopolitical tool. The Americans tried to stop Japan from becoming militaristic by putting a trade blockade on it. Well, that worked out well for them, didn't it? Yeah? It just doesn't work. Look what Trump's doing at the moment. I didn't go to the rare session, but Trump, thinks that by putting tariffs on China, it can somehow force it to give America the things that it needs and not to compete in the things that America wants to produce. I mean, what sort of fantasy world is that? We know Trump is going to have to back down on this. you backed down on it last time, because if you put on tariffs on China and China says, we're not starting anything here, but we do have 90% of the magnets and 90% of the processing of rare earths, and don't you need those for your airplanes? Don't you need those for everything else that you produce that you may use in a war against us? He's going to back down on this because, for some stupid reason, nothing to do with world trade, no, not some stupid reason, because of the illiteracy, the geopolitical illiteracy of the American elite, they could see 25 years ago that China was strategically taking over the rare earths, right? They weren't stupid, but they were illiterate.
Can I interject here? First things, the steel industry could still be in the UK. 70% of our exports of steel are scrap steel. And we export them, and they are refined and recycled in Turkey, India, and Egypt, because they have cheap power and we don't have cheap industrial power.
Quite.
And second, we drove the refining of rare earths out of the US and Australia, which used to be the biggest producers, because of our the US EPA rules.
Yeah.
So that we drove it out. They didn't steal it from us. We drove it away.
I agree entirely. Of course they didn't steal it. It was the illiteracy of saying, oh, yeah, there's environmental problems with rare earths. It's not a very nice thing to do. It's costly, causes damage, and so on. So rather than have any strategic foresight as to what that might mean.
Well, it's the carbon. It's too expensive with carbon dioxide. Too much carbon
dioxide. We find ourselves, because we never. We find ourselves that we're reliant on rare earth smelting. What I'm saying is, even as a geopolitical weapon, trade. I don't know any examples where trade actually works, supposedly in the national interest. So I conclude by saying, I think that to deal with these problems that we have in Britain and geopolitically, if everyone pursued national interest on the basis of we're looking at what is in the long-term interest of their country, of their people, and that primarily means build to your strengths, don't try and have a nostalgic attachment to something which is gone. Build to your strengths, and through that have the capabilities to be able to do lots of things, and also have the wealth then to import what you can't produce internally.
Okay, can we thank our panelists?